The bridge of the Aurora's edge hummed with quiet efficiency as Captain Jake Morrison reviewed the daily reports from his crew. The exploration vessel had been patrolling the Outer Rim territories for 6 months now, mapping new trade routes, and keeping an eye on the growing tensions between the various alien species that called this region home. It was routine work, the kind that kept the peace but rarely made headlines back on Earth. Lieutenant Amy Parker looked up from her communications console, her brow furrowed with concentration. She had been monitoring the standard frequencies all morning, but something new had caught her attention. The signal was weak, almost lost in the background noise of space, but it was definitely artificial. Someone was trying to send a message. "Captain, I'm picking up a transmission from Grid 77 Alpha," she said, adjusting the controls to try and clean up the signal. "It's coming from the direction of the Cytherian-controlled sectors." Morrison felt his stomach tighten at the mention of the Cytherians. The reptilian species had been expanding their territory aggressively for the past 5 years, conquering world after world with brutal efficiency. Their military was advanced, their tactics were ruthless, and they showed no mercy to those who opposed them. Most species in the galaxy had learned to give them a wide berth. "Can you clean it up?" Morrison asked, moving to stand behind Parker's station. The young officer had a gift for communications work, often managing to pull coherent messages from what seemed like pure static. Parker's fingers danced across her controls as she worked to filter out the interference. Slowly a voice began to emerge from the noise. It was speaking in Standard Galactic, the common tongue used for interspecies communication. But there was something different about the accent. It was refined, almost musical, unlike anything Morrison had heard before. "This is Princess Zarathil of the Valdari Royal House," the voice said, crackling through the static. "I am transmitting from Detention Facility 799 on the third moon of Corvax Prime. My people have been destroyed, our worlds conquered, our knowledge stolen. I am the last of my kind, and I will be executed in 3 days. I do not ask for rescue, for I know the cost would be too great. I only ask that someone remember us, that someone knows the Valdari tried to make the galaxy a better place." The bridge fell silent as the message repeated itself, the transmission looping every few minutes. Morrison felt something cold settle in his chest as he processed what he was hearing. The Valdari had been legends in the galaxy, master terraformers, who could turn dead worlds into gardens. Their homeworld had been a paradise, a place where different species lived in harmony and the very air seemed to sing with life. "Sir," came a voice from the science station. Chief Science Officer Danny Rodriguez was pulling up data on his screens, his expression grim. "I've been researching the Valdari since we started receiving this transmission. They were conquered by the Cytherians 8 months ago. Intelligence reports suggest the entire population was eliminated to prevent their terraforming secrets from being used against Cytherian interests." Morrison nodded grimly. The Cytherians had a pattern of eliminating species that might pose a threat to their expansion plans. The Valdari, with their ability to restore damaged ecosystems and create habitable worlds, would have been seen as a significant strategic threat. A species that could quickly terraform worlds could potentially create strongholds that would be difficult for the Cytherians to assault. "How far is this detention facility from our current position?" Morrison asked, though he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Approximately 18 hours at maximum warp, sir," Parker replied. "But it's deep inside Cytherian space. The area is heavily patrolled, and any human vessel would be detected long before it could reach the facility." Morrison stared at the tactical display showing their current position relative to the Cytherian territories. The Aurora's Edge was a good ship, but it was designed for exploration, not combat. Against the Cytherian fleet, they would be hopelessly outgunned. Any rescue attempt would likely result in the destruction of his ship and the death of his entire crew. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "there's something else you should know about the Valdari. Our databases indicate they possessed advanced ecological engineering techniques that could reverse environmental damage on a massive scale. Several human colonies in the outer sectors are currently facing ecological collapse. The Valdari knowledge could save millions of lives. Morrison felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. One alien princess, the last of her kind, sitting in a Cytherian prison cell waiting to die. Against that, the lives of his crew and the political implications of unauthorized military action in hostile territory. The Colonial Defense Force had strict orders about avoiding conflicts with the Cytherians. Humanity was still a relatively new member of the galactic community, and they couldn't afford to make enemies of such a powerful species. "Captain," Parker said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the transmission is getting weaker. I don't think she has much power left." Morrison closed his eyes and listened to the princess's voice as it continued to loop through the speakers. There was no desperation in her tone, no pleading for rescue. She had accepted her fate with dignity, asking only that someone remember her people. It was that quiet courage that made Morrison's decision for him. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need you to run a full analysis of Cytherian patrol patterns in that sector," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was considering. "Miss Parker, I want you to keep monitoring that transmission and see if you can establish two-way communication. And I want both of you to understand that what we're discussing here doesn't leave this bridge." Both officers nodded, understanding the implications. Morrison was considering something that went against every regulation in the book, something that could end his career and possibly start a war. But as he listened to Princess Zarathel's voice continuing to transmit her final message into the void, he knew he couldn't simply ignore it. The galaxy was full of species that had chosen to look the other way when faced with difficult decisions. They prioritized their own safety over the lives of others, their own interests over what was right. Morrison had joined the Colonial Defense Force because he believed humanity could be better than that. Now it was time to prove it. "Sir," Rodriguez said, looking up from his analysis, "I've found something. There's a gap in their patrol routes, a narrow window where we might be able to slip through undetected. It would require precise timing and some very dangerous flying, but it's theoretically possible." Morrison nodded, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with making a decision that would change everything. He was about to commit mutiny, risk his ship and crew, and potentially start an interstellar incident. But somewhere in the darkness of space, the last Valdari princess was counting down the hours until her execution, and Morrison couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to save her. Morrison called for an emergency meeting in the ship's main briefing room. The senior staff gathered around the polished metal table, their faces showing curiosity mixed with concern. They had all noticed the unusual activity on the bridge, the hushed conversations and the tension in their captain's voice when he spoke over the intercom. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room," Morrison began, his hands clasped behind his back as he stood at the head of the table. "We've received a distress signal from the last surviving member of the Valdari royal family. She's being held in a Cytherian prison facility and will be executed in less than 3 days." Lieutenant Amy Parker shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had been monitoring the transmission for hours now, trying to establish better contact with the princess. The signal was growing weaker by the hour, suggesting that her power source was running out. "Sir," said Chief Medical Officer Dr. Lisa Hayes, "the Valdari were declared extinct months ago. If there's truly a survivor, shouldn't we contact Colonial Command and let them handle this through diplomatic channels?" Morrison had expected this response. Dr. Hayes was thorough and methodical, always following proper procedures. It was one of the qualities that made her an excellent medical officer, but it also meant she was uncomfortable with anything that deviated from established protocols. "The Galactic Council has already been informed about the situation," Morrison replied. "They've chosen not to act. The political risks are considered too great. The Cytherians have made it clear that any interference will be met with military force." Danny Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, his engineering mind already working through the technical challenges. "Captain, what exactly are you suggesting?" "A rescue mission into Cytherian space would be suicide. The Aurora's Edge isn't equipped for that kind of operation." Morrison activated the holographic display in the center of the table, showing a three-dimensional map of the local sector. The Catherian territories were marked in red, a vast expanse of controlled space that had grown significantly over the past few years. Deep within that red zone, a small dot pulsed to indicate the location of the prison facility. "I've been analyzing their patrol patterns," Morrison said, manipulating the display to show the movement of Catherian vessels. "There's a narrow corridor, a gap in their coverage that occurs every 47 hours. If we time it perfectly, we could slip through undetected." Security Chief Ben Collins, a former Marine who had served in 3 different conflicts, shook his head. "Even if we could reach the facility, how do we get inside? These aren't civilian detention centers we're talking about. Catherian prisons are military installations designed to hold the galaxy's most dangerous criminals." Morrison had been thinking about this problem for hours. The Catherians built their facilities like fortresses, with multiple layers of security and enough firepower to repel a small fleet. A direct assault would be impossible, but there might be another way. "The facility is built into the moon's surface," Morrison explained, zooming in on the detention center. "It uses the moon's natural electromagnetic field to power its systems and create a defensive shield. But that same field creates interference patterns that could mask our approach if we're careful." Parker looked up from her tablet where she had been running calculations. "You're talking about a hyperspace jump directly into the moon's atmosphere. The gravitational stresses alone could tear the ship apart, and if we miscalculate by even a few kilometers, we'll either crash into the surface or materialize inside solid rock." "The risks are significant," Morrison admitted, "but they're manageable if we prepare properly. Rodriguez, I need you to run a full diagnostic on our hyperspace systems. I want every component checked and rechecked. Parker, I need you to calculate the exact entry coordinates. We'll only get one chance at this." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What Morrison was proposing wasn't just dangerous, it was essentially mutiny. They would be disobeying direct orders from Colonial Command and potentially starting a war with one of the galaxy's most powerful species. Dr. Hayes spoke first, her voice carefully controlled. "Captain, I have to ask, is one life worth risking? The entire crew? Worth potentially damaging humanity's standing in the galactic community?" Morrison had asked himself the same question dozens of times since receiving the transmission. The logical answer was no. One alien princess, no matter how important her knowledge might be, wasn't worth the lives of his crew or the political consequences of unauthorized military action. "The Valdari aren't just any species," Morrison said quietly. "Their ecological knowledge could save dying worlds across the galaxy. Several human colonies are facing environmental collapse right now. Children are dying on New Eden because the atmosphere is becoming toxic. The terraforming project on Kepler Station has failed completely. The Valdari techniques could reverse that damage and save millions of lives." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I've been reading about their work. They didn't just terraform worlds, they created complete ecosystems that could adapt and evolve. It's technology that's centuries ahead of anything we have. But there's something else," Morrison continued. "Something that goes beyond the strategic value of Valdari knowledge. The Catherians are systematically eliminating species that might pose a threat to their expansion. The Valdari are just the beginning. How long before they decide humanity is too dangerous to be allowed to exist?" Collins leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You're saying this is about more than just saving one person. You're saying it's about making a statement." "I'm saying it's about doing what's right," Morrison replied. "The galaxy is full of species that have chosen to look the other way when faced with difficult decisions. They prioritize their own safety over the lives of others. But that's not who we are. That's not who humanity is supposed to be." The debate continued for another hour, with each officer raising valid concerns about the mission. The technical challenges were enormous, the political risks were severe, and the chances of success were minimal. But gradually something shifted in the room. The crew began to see the mission not as a reckless adventure, But as a defining moment for humanity's place in the galaxy. Parker was the first to volunteer. If we're going to do this, I want to be on the away team. My communication skills might be useful for coordinating with the princess. Rodriguez nodded. I'll need to modify our hyperspace systems for the precision jump. It's going to require some creative engineering, but I think I can make it work. Even Dr. Hayes, despite her concerns, agreed to prepare medical supplies for the rescue operation. If we're bringing back a Valdari, I should research their biology and medical needs. Morrison felt a surge of pride as he looked around the table at his crew. They were scared, he could see it in their eyes, but they were willing to follow him into danger because they believed in the mission. They believed in the idea that sometimes doing the right thing required taking enormous risks. All right, then, Morrison said, his voice steady and determined. We have 36 hours to prepare. Rodriguez, I want those hyperspace modifications completed and tested. Parker, I need those coordinates calculated down to the centimeter. Collins, work with Dr. Hayes to prepare the away team equipment. We're going to pull off the impossible, and we're going to do it together. The hyperspace jump was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. The Aurora's edge shuddered and groaned as it materialized inside the moon's upper atmosphere, the electromagnetic interference creating a light show of dancing colors across the view screen. Morrison gripped his command chair as the ship bucked and rolled, fighting against gravitational forces that threatened to tear it apart. Hull stress at 90% of tolerance, Rodriguez reported from his engineering station, his voice tight with concentration. But we're holding together. The modifications are working. Parker's fingers flew across her navigation controls as she tried to stabilize their position. The interference from the moon's magnetic field was playing havoc with their sensors, creating false readings and phantom contacts that made it nearly impossible to get accurate positioning data. I'm reading the facility, she announced, her voice barely audible over the sound of straining metal. Distance 200 kilometers and closing. The electromagnetic signature is masking our approach, but it's also making it hard to see where we're going. Morrison forced himself to remain calm as he watched the tactical display. They had successfully penetrated the moon's defenses, but now came the really difficult part. The prison facility was buried deep underground, accessible only through a series of heavily guarded surface entrances. Their only advantage was that the Catherians would never expect anyone to be crazy enough to attempt a rescue. Take us down to landing coordinates, Morrison ordered. Collins, get your team ready. We're going fast and quiet. The security chief nodded and activated his communicator. Alpha team to the shuttle bay, full combat gear and stealth equipment. We have 15 minutes to insertion. The Aurora's edge settled onto the moon's surface with a soft thud, its landing engines barely audible in the thin atmosphere. Through the view screen, Morrison could see the barren landscape stretching out in all directions, broken only by the occasional metal structure that marked an entrance to the underground facility. Sensors are picking up guard positions, Parker reported. 2 sentries at the main entrance, automated defense systems covering the secondary access points, but there's something else. I'm detecting a maintenance shaft about half a kilometer. From our position, it appears to be unguarded. Morrison studied the readings on his display. The maintenance shaft was small, barely large enough for a human to crawl through, but it led directly into the lower levels of the facility. It would be a tight squeeze, but it might be their only chance to get inside without triggering the alarm systems. Collins, change of plans, Morrison said. We're going through the maintenance system. It's going to be close quarters, but it's our best shot at reaching the detention levels undetected. The security chief grimaced but nodded. Understood. Sir, it's going to limit our equipment options, but we can make it work. Morrison stood and headed for the exit. I'm coming with you. Sir, with respect, your place is on the bridge, Collins protested. If something goes wrong, the ship needs its captain. The ship needs to be ready to run if we don't make it back, Morrison replied. Rodriguez, you have the con. If we're not back in 2 hours, take the ship and get out of here. Don't try to rescue us, the engineer nodded grimly. Understood, Captain, but for the record, I think you're all crazy. Morrison smiled despite the tension. Probably, but sometimes crazy is what gets the job done. The maintenance shaft was even smaller than the sensors had indicated. Morrison and Collins crawled through the narrow metal tunnel, their equipment packs scraping against the walls as they made their way deeper into the facility. The air was stale and recycled, with an odd, metallic taste that suggested the life support systems were working at minimum capacity. Motion sensors ahead, Collins whispered, pointing to a junction where the tunnel branched off in 3 directions. Standard Cytherian security grid. I can disable them, but it's going to take time. Morrison checked his chronometer. They had been underground for 47 minutes, and they still hadn't reached the detention levels. Every second they delayed increased the risk of discovery. Do it, Morrison said. But make it fast. Collins pulled out a small device that looked like a modified scanner. He attached it to the sensor array and began working, his fingers moving with practiced precision. The device hummed quietly as it interfaced with the Cytherian systems, searching for the right frequency to disable the motion detectors without triggering an alarm. Got it, Collins said after what felt like an eternity. We have a clear path to the detention level, but the window won't last long. They'll notice the sensor malfunction eventually. They crawled through the tunnel system for another 20 minutes, following the maintenance blueprints that Parker had downloaded from the facility's external systems. The detention level was exactly as Morrison had expected, a series of reinforced cells built into the moon's bedrock, each one designed to hold the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. There, Collins pointed to a cell at the far end of the corridor. That's where the signal is coming from. Morrison peered through the small window in the cell door and saw her for the first time. Princess Zarethel was smaller than he had expected. Maybe 5.5 feet tall, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her clothing was torn and stained, showing signs of rough treatment, but she sat with perfect posture, her head held high with unmistakable dignity. "Princess," Morrison called softly through the door. "We're here to get you out." She looked up, and Morrison saw surprise flicker across her features. Her eyes were large and dark, with an intelligence that reminded him of deep ocean waters. When she spoke, her voice was the same musical tone he had heard in the transmission, but now it carried a note of wonder. "You came," she said, rising to her feet. "I did not think anyone would risk so much for a stranger." "We're not leaving." "You hear," Morrison said as Collins worked on the cell door locks. "But we need to move fast. The guards will be making their rounds soon." The lock clicked open, and Princess Zarethel stepped out of her cell. She was weaker than she appeared, Morrison noticed, probably from inadequate food and water. But she moved with grace and determination, clearly prepared to do whatever was necessary to escape. "There are other prisoners," she said, gesturing to the cells around them. "Innocent people who have been imprisoned for opposing Cytherian expansion. We cannot leave them." Morrison felt his heart sink. The mission was already incredibly dangerous with just one person to rescue. Adding more prisoners would make it nearly impossible to escape undetected. "Princess, we barely have enough resources to get you out safely," Collins said. "Adding more people to the mission ... would be the right thing to do," Morrison said, cutting him off. He looked at the princess and saw something in her eyes that reminded him why he had become a soldier in the first place. "How many prisoners are we talking about?" 12, she replied, "including a scientist who has been working on ecological restoration projects. His knowledge combined with mine could save entire worlds." Morrison made his decision. "Collins, start opening the cells. We're taking everyone." The security chief looked at him as if he had lost his mind, but he began working on the locks. "Sir, this is going to complicate our escape considerably. The maintenance tunnels won't accommodate this many people." "Then they'll have to find another way out," Morrison said. "We didn't come this far to leave people behind." As the cell doors opened one by one, Morrison realized that he had just made their impossible mission even more impossible. But as he watched the prisoners emerge, seeing hope return to their faces for the first time in months, he knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks that others wouldn't take, and that was exactly what humanity was supposed to be about. The alarm began wailing just as the last prisoner stepped out of their cell. Red lights flashed throughout the detention level, and Morrison could hear the heavy footsteps of Cytherian guards running through the corridors above them. Their window of opportunity had just slammed shut. "They know we're here," Collins said, checking his weapon and scanning the corridor for threats. "The maintenance tunnel is our only way out, but with this many people, we'll never make it before they seal off the facility." Morrison looked at the group of rescued prisoners huddled around them. Besides Princess Zarathul, there were representatives from 6 different species, all of whom had been captured for opposing Cytherian expansion. They were weak from imprisonment, scared, and completely dependent on Morrison's team for survival. "There has to be another way," Morrison said, activating his communicator. "Rodriguez, we have a problem. The facility is on full alert, and we have 13 people to evacuate instead of 1. The engineer's voice crackled through the static-filled connection. "Captain, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the facility's defense systems. They're powering up weapons that could punch through our hull even at this distance. We need to get out of here now." Princess Zarathul moved closer to Morrison, her voice urgent but calm. "Captain, I know this facility. There is a cargo transport system that connects to the surface loading docks. It was designed to move large shipments of prisoners to and from the facility. Can we access it from here?" Morrison asked, hope flickering in his chest. "Yes, but it requires going through the main security checkpoint. The guards will be waiting for us." Morrison weighed their options. The maintenance tunnel was too small for the group, and trying to fight their way through the main security checkpoint would be suicide. But Princess Zarethul's suggestion gave him an idea. "Collins, what kind of diversion could we create with our remaining explosives?" Morrison asked. The security chief's eyes lit up with understanding. "If we could trigger a containment breach in the lower levels, it would draw most of the guards away from the transport system. But someone would have to stay behind to set the charges." "I'll do it," Morrison said immediately. "No, sir," Collins replied firmly. "This is exactly the kind of job security teams are trained for. You need to get the princess and the others to safety. I'll catch up with you at the transport system." Morrison wanted to argue, but he knew Collins was right. The mission was bigger than any one person, even the captain. He nodded reluctantly and turned to address the group of prisoners. "We're going to split up," he announced. "I'll take you to the transport system while Collins creates a diversion. Stay close, move quietly, and do exactly what I tell you." Princess Zarathul placed a hand on Morrison's arm. "Captain, there is something you must know. The Cytherians have been using this facility for more than just detention. They have been conducting experiments, trying to understand how different species think and react under pressure. They have been studying human psychology specifically." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of experiments? "They have been testing human responses to impossible situations, trying to understand why your species takes risks that others will not. They believe that if they can understand human courage, they can eliminate it." The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. The Cytherians weren't just expanding their territory randomly. They were systematically studying and eliminating the traits that made other species dangerous to them. Humanity's willingness to take risks, to fight impossible odds, to sacrifice for others, these were exactly the qualities that the Cytherians feared most. "Then we need to make sure they don't get the chance to complete their research," Morrison said grimly. The group moved through the facility's corridors like shadows, following Princess Zarathul's guidance toward the transport system. Morrison could hear explosions echoing through the complex as Collins set his charges, drawing the guards away from their escape route. "There!" Princess Zarathul pointed to a large metal door marked with Cytherian symbols. "The transport loading bay is through there." Morrison approached the door carefully and peered through the reinforced window. The loading bay was enormous, designed to accommodate large cargo ships. But it was also heavily guarded, with at least 20 Cytherian soldiers positioned around the perimeter. "Too many guards," Morrison muttered. Even with Colin's diversion, we'll never make it past them. Captain, said a voice behind him. Morrison turned to see one of the rescued prisoners, an elderly being from a species he didn't recognize. I am Dr. Kevin Liu, formerly of the Centauri Science Institute. I've been working with Princess Zarathul on ecological restoration projects. Morrison blinked in surprise. You're human? Yes, Captain. I was captured while trying to establish a research station in neutral space. I have been here for 8 months, and I have learned much about Cytherian psychology. They respect strength but fear unpredictability. If we can make them believe we are more dangerous than we actually are, they may hesitate long enough for us to escape. Morrison considered this. The Cytherians were efficient and logical, but they were also cautious. They preferred to overwhelm their enemies with superior firepower rather than risk casualties in fair fights. What do you suggest? Morrison asked. We need to make them think we have support they cannot see. If they believe there are more human ships waiting to attack, they may choose to negotiate rather than fight. Morrison activated his communicator, switching to a general broadcast frequency that the Cytherians would be monitoring. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Colonial Defense Force vessel Aurora's Edge. We have successfully infiltrated your facility and rescued our people. We are prepared to leave peacefully, but any attempt to stop us will result in the complete destruction of this installation. The response came immediately, a harsh voice speaking in accented galactic standard. Human Captain, you are surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now, and your death will be quick. I don't think you understand the situation, Morrison replied, putting every ounce of confidence he could muster into his voice. We have placed fusion charges throughout your facility. If we don't report back to our fleet in 10 minutes, this entire moon will be nothing but radioactive dust. There was a long pause, and Morrison could almost hear the Cytherian commander calculating odds and possibilities. Finally, the voice returned, less certain than before. You are bluffing, human. Your species is too weak to threaten us. Are you willing to bet your life on that assessment? Morrison asked. Because I guarantee you, if you try to stop us, you'll find out exactly how far humans are willing to go to protect their own. Through the window, Morrison could see the guards shifting nervously, their weapons trained on the loading bay entrance, but their body language showing uncertainty. The Cytherians had studied human psychology, but they had never faced a human who was willing to risk everything for a principle. You have 5 minutes to clear the loading bay, Morrison announced. After that, we're coming through whether you're ready or not? Princess Zarathul looked at Morrison with something approaching awe. You are gambling with all our lives on pure bluff. Not entirely, Morrison replied. Collins really did plant those charges, and they really will destroy a significant portion of the facility. The question is whether the Cytherians are willing to risk finding out how much damage we can actually do. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Morrison could see the guards in the loading bay receiving orders through their communication systems. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to withdraw from the bay, taking up defensive positions in the corridors beyond. It's working, Morrison said, hardly believing it himself. They're actually backing down. Do not underestimate what you have accomplished here, Captain, Princess Zarathul said. The Cytherians have never retreated from a confrontation with an inferior force. You have done something that will be remembered across the galaxy. The Aurora's Edge lifted off from the moon's surface just as the Cytherian fleet arrived. Morrison watched through the viewscreen as dozens of warships dropped out of hyperspace, their weapons already charging for combat. The electromagnetic interference that had hidden their approach was now working against them, making it difficult to establish a clean hyperspace jump. They're jamming our communications, Parker reported from her station. I can't establish contact with Colonial Command or any other human vessels in the area. Morrison wasn't surprised. The Cytherians wanted to handle this situation quietly, without word getting out that a single human ship had successfully raided one of their most secure facilities. But their jamming was also preventing them from calling for reinforcements, which gave Morrison a small advantage. How long until we can jump? Morrison asked Rodriguez, who was working frantically at his engineering console. The hyperspace systems are still cycling from our atmospheric entry, Rodriguez replied. I need at least 3 more minutes to stabilize the field generators. 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours with the Catherian fleet bearing down on them. Morrison could see the lead ships already adjusting their course to intercept, their weapon systems glowing with deadly energy. Captain, Princess Zarethel said from the auxiliary station where she had been helping to monitor their escape, there is something you should know about the research the Catherians were conducting. They were not just studying human psychology for military purposes. Morrison glanced at her while keeping one eye on the tactical display. What do you mean? They were trying to understand how humans inspire others to acts of courage. They have observed that other species become braver, more willing to take risks when they work alongside humans. They consider this a dangerous form of contagion that could threaten their expansion plans. Dr. Liu, who had been quietly tending to the other, rescued prisoners in the ship's medical bay, joined the conversation. The princess is correct, Captain. During my imprisonment, I overheard Catherian commanders discussing what they call the human factor in galactic politics. They believe that humanity's influence on other species is far more dangerous than human military capability. Morrison felt a strange mixture of pride and responsibility at these words. If the Catherians were right, then humanity's greatest weapon wasn't advanced technology or superior tactics, but simply the willingness to do what was right regardless of the consequences. Incoming transmission, Parker announced. It's from the Catherian fleet commander. Put it through, Morrison ordered. The view screen flickered and the image of a Catherian military officer appeared. His reptilian features were set in an expression of cold fury, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Human captain, you have violated our sovereign territory and stolen our prisoners. Return them immediately, and we may allow your crew to live. Morrison stood up slowly, meeting the alien commander's gaze with steady determination. The people on this ship are not prisoners, they're refugees, and they're under the protection of the Colonial Defense Force. You speak of protection, but you are alone and outnumbered 50-1. Your ship will be destroyed, and your crew will join the prisoners you sought to rescue. Maybe, Morrison replied, but you'll have to catch us first. The transmission ended abruptly, and Morrison turned to his crew. Rodriguez, tell me you have good news. Hyperspace systems are online, but our jump accuracy is going to be limited by the interference. I can get us out of here, but I can't guarantee where we'll end up. Anywhere is better than here, Morrison said. Make the jump. The Aurora's edge disappeared into hyperspace just as the first Catherian missiles reached their position. But Morrison knew their escape was only temporary. The Catherians would track their hyperspace signature and follow them wherever they went. We need to get word to Colonial Command, Morrison said as the ship traveled through the swirling vortex of hyperspace. They need to know what the Catherians are really planning. Sir, Parker said, even if we could contact them, would they believe us? We've just committed an act of war against one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. Morrison had been thinking about this problem since they left the prison facility. By any military standard, he had violated direct orders and potentially started an interstellar conflict. But he had also rescued 13 innocent people and gained crucial intelligence about Catherian plans. Princess, Morrison said, turning to Zarethel, you mentioned that your knowledge combined with Dr. Liu's research could save dying worlds. How quickly could you implement these techniques? The princess exchanged a glance with Dr. Liu before answering. With the proper resources and cooperation from local governments, we could begin restoring damaged ecosystems within weeks. The human colonies you mentioned, the ones facing environmental collapse, could be saved. Morrison made his decision. Then that's what we're going to do. We're going to prove that this rescue was worth the risk by using your knowledge to save lives. Over the following months, Morrison's unauthorized rescue mission became the catalyst for changes that swept across the galaxy. Princess Zarethel and Dr. Liu worked together to establish ecological restoration programs on dozens of worlds. Starting with the human colonies that had been facing environmental disaster, the success of these programs attracted attention from other species who had been struggling with similar problems. Worlds that had been written off as uninhabitable began to bloom with new life, and the combined Valdari human techniques proved more effective than anyone had imagined, but more importantly, Morrison's willingness to risk everything for strangers inspired others to similar acts of courage. Species that had been cowering in fear of Catherian expansion began to stand up for themselves and their neighbors. The rescue of Princess Zarethel became a symbol of hope that spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The Galactic Council, initially furious with Morrison's actions, gradually came to realize that his mission had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Species that had been isolated and afraid were now forming alliances based on mutual support rather than mutual fear. Morrison himself faced a military tribunal for his actions, but the charges were quietly dropped when it became clear that public opinion strongly supported him. Instead of being court-martialed, he was promoted and given command of a new joint task force dedicated to protecting vulnerable species from Catherian aggression. Years later, as Morrison stood on the observation deck of his new flagship watching, a restored world turned green beneath them. Princess Zarethel joined him. She had become not just an ally but a close friend, and together they had overseen the transformation of more than 50 worlds. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The risk you took, the consequences you faced?" Morrison smiled as he watched ships from a dozen different species working together in orbit around the restored planet. Never. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks that others won't take. That's what makes us human. The princess nodded, understanding finally why the Catherians had feared humanity so much. It wasn't their technology or their military might that made them dangerous. It was their willingness to risk everything for a stranger, to stand up for what was right even when the odds were impossible. "The galaxy is a better place because of what you did," she said. "No," Morrison replied, watching his children from multiple species played together in the restored parks below. "The galaxy is a better place because of what we all did together. That's the real lesson here. When we work together, when we're willing to sacrifice for each other, there's nothing we can't accomplish." The Catherian Empire still existed, still threatened the peace of the galaxy, but they no longer faced isolated, frightened species. They faced a growing alliance of worlds that had learned the value of courage, sacrifice, and standing together against tyranny. And at the heart of that alliance was the simple human belief that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost.